In a courtroom heavy with silence, one word, boy, shattered the air, exposing a truth buried for years. A black man in a navy suit sat still, accused of crimes he never committed. But within minutes, his identity would turn the trial upside down, and power itself would shift. Want to know how? Watch till the end. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video for more powerful stories. The courtroom was not merely a room that morning. It was a furnace where silence and power pressed against the walls like a weight. The gallery was crowded, families leaning forward, reporters shifting pens between fingers, the hum of anticipation already electric before a word was spoken. At exactly 10 o'clock, the bailiff called for order. Everyone rose, then sat, and in that ritual silence, authority was supposed to feel secure. Yet within seconds, one voice shattered the illusion. "Stand when I speak, boy," barked Deputy Harris Wolfe, his words slicing through the chamber like broken glass. It was not simply what he said, but how he said it. The syllables cracked with contempt, the venom of ownership, as if the century had not shifted and the courthouse itself had never shed its darker skin of history. The gallery froze as though the walls had inhaled and refused to exhale. The insult hung in the air, heavy, choking, impossible to ignore. Yet no one moved. No one breathed a protest. The man he targeted, Marcus Ellison, did not rise. He sat in a navy suit tailored sharp to his frame, his hands resting calmly on his folded arms, his gaze steady and unblinking. Not a twitch, not a flinch, not a shadow of compliance crossed his face. His stillness was louder than any defense could have been, louder than Wolfe's bark, louder than the whispers stifled in the back rows. The silence was not empty. It was resistance embodied. Wolfe's jaw tightened, his pale face red with indignation, his badge gleaming like a weapon on his chest. For years, 10, 15, 20, he had gotten away with this reflex, this habit of degradation, and the court had played its role each time. His word carried weight, his lies were dressed as law, and his rage was mistaken for authority. Yet here, in this moment, the word boy did not echo with obedience. It crashed against Marcus's composure and fell flat, impotent. And still, no one intervened. Not the bailiff who had called for order, not the stenographer whose fingers hovered over keys frozen mid-air, not the gallery where mouths hung open. Above all, not Judge Morton Hale, robed and elevated, perched in his chair as if the insult had never reached his ears. His pale face remained unreadable, lips sealed, hands folded over the bench. His silence was not neutrality, it was consent. That stillness at the top of the court spoke volumes louder than Wolfe's insult. Hale did not need to spit the word himself. He merely needed to let it pass unchallenged, unpunished, unremarked. And in doing so, he revealed his allegiance not to justice, not to fairness, but to the unspoken code that had haunted courtrooms across decades. Protect the badge, protect the bench, even if it means stripping dignity from the accused. Marcus's refusal to move became a mirror. It forced every person in that courtroom to look at themselves, to measure their own silence. Was it fear that glued their tongues? Was it habit, the kind of compliance that grows in generations of watching the system crush voices of dissent? Or was it complicity, the quieter violence that cloaks itself as procedure and professionalism? In that single instant, time stretched. Seconds ticked like hours. The fluorescent lights hummed. Somewhere in the gallery, a baby whimpered before being hushed, as though even infants understood that something unnatural had occurred. Harris Wolfe stepped forward, his boots heavy against the floor, echoing louder than needed, as though sound could substitute for truth. He puffed out his chest, his name tag catching the glow of the overhead lamps. Deputy H. Wolfe. That name had become familiar to some in the gallery, mothers whose sons had been stopped for broken taillights, fathers whose nephews had been dragged into holding cells for furtive movements. Wolfe's reputation whispered down back streets and into Sunday sermons, a name attached to bruises, to fines, to silence. And now, in this room, he was not content with just a charge. He demanded humiliation. He demanded obedience. He demanded Marcus rise and, in rising, affirm his place below. But Marcus did not move. His posture was deliberate, carved from years of quiet discipline. His folded arms were not defense, they were defiance. His gaze steady, not confrontational, but unyielding. He refused to play the role written for him in Wolfe's script. He would not be the boy, the caricature, the powerless defendant waiting for mercy from systems that had long denied it. Instead, his silence struck like thunder muffled by dignity. Judge Hale finally shifted in his chair, not to correct Wolfe, not to defend the integrity of the court, but to adjust his glasses and glance toward the docket. As if paperwork mattered more than justice. As if the insult could be swept beneath the gavel, hidden under case numbers and signatures. His silence was a verdict before the trial even began. It revealed what Marcus already knew. The courtroom itself was not neutral ground. The scales of justice had been tipped before he walked in, the outcome weighed by prejudice before evidence was even mentioned. The gallery whispered now, low murmurs that rippled like tremors in the earth. Some exchanged glances, unsure whether to admire Marcus's courage or to fear the explosion Wolfe's temper promised. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens scratching like knives across paper. Some leaned forward, sensing that this case was not like the others, that something in the air was about to shift. They had covered trials before, had witnessed angry outbursts and quiet settlements, but never had they seen silence stand so tall. Never had they seen a man sit so still against such ugliness. Deputy Wolfe's voice cracked again, louder, harsher, trying to bury his own insecurity beneath volume. Yet beneath that bark was a tremor. He expected compliance, instant and unquestioned. The absence of it rattled him, made him reveal more of himself than he intended. The insult was not just habit, it was desperation. Without submission, his authority frayed, unraveling thread by thread in front of eyes that could no longer unsee. And still, Marcus Ellison said nothing, not a word. His silence spoke entire histories, of ancestors who endured chains, of voices drowned out in courts, of verdicts sealed before trials began. His stillness carried the weight of centuries, and in that weight, Wolfe found no purchase. The insult floated in the stale courtroom air, but instead of piercing, it decayed, rotted, and left behind a stench that Judge Hale could no longer pretend did not exist. This was not just the opening of a trial, it was the unveiling of a system's rot. The racist command and the judge's silence were more than moments. They were indictments of the very institutions sworn to uphold fairness. What unfolded in those first few seconds would ripple outward, not just through the next hour, but through weeks, months, years. That morning, justice did not stumble quietly. It was caught, exposed, naked under the fluorescent lights of a courtroom that believed itself untouchable. And as the gallery held its breath, no one realized that Marcus was not there to play the defendant at all. He was there to reveal the truth. His stillness was not weakness. It was the first move in a revelation that would turn every title, every badge, every robe upside down.
The insult had cracked like a whip, but Marcus Ellison's body did not bend, not even an inch. He remained seated, legs grounded, arms folded against the chest of his navy suit, a suit cut with such precision it seemed to resist the room itself. His stillness was deliberate, almost sculptural, as though the chair beneath him were not a seat, but a throne borrowed for this very moment. The insult boy still hovered in the air like smoke after gunpowder, yet Marcus did not swat at it, did not reach to clear it. He let it hang there, decaying, losing its force by the second. His eyes, sharp and steady, traveled the length of the courtroom, not with arrogance, not with hostility, but with a calm so absolute it felt dangerous. Every person watching felt it differently. To some, his silence was defiance. To others, it was audacity. But to all, it was unshakable. Deputy Harris Wolfe, standing only a few feet away, seethed. The redness in his face deepened, blotches of anger rising beneath the skin like fire through paper. His jaw flexed, his fist tightened at his side, and his badge seemed to gleam brighter, as though it demanded acknowledgement. He was a man used to obedience, to eyes darting away and heads bowing under his bark. Yet here was Marcus Ellison, younger than 40, sitting in a courtroom packed with strangers and officials refusing to move. Refusing him. Wolfe's fury was no longer about procedure. It was personal. He had built a career on submission, and in 30 seconds, this man in a Navy suit threatened to undo years of assumed dominance. Across the bench, Judge Morton Hale leaned back in his chair, lips pressed thin fingers drumming the polished wood. He did not intervene, did not correct Wolfe, did not acknowledge the insult that had poisoned the air. His silence was not born of shock. It was a silence too practiced, too comfortable. Hale was the embodiment of judicial detachment. Pale face, expressionless eyes, lowered toward papers, as if the weight of history had not just rattled the walls of his courtroom. He had seen men like Wolfe before, had presided over their testimony, had overlooked their language. To him, Marcus Ellison's stillness was not dignity, it was insolence, a breach of decorum, that quietly threatened his own authority. Yet Hale did nothing. The gavel sat untouched. His robe, heavy with the illusion of impartiality, draped him like a shield. The gallery felt the tension crawl across their skin. Mothers in the back row clutched their purses tighter. Fathers shifted uncomfortably. Journalists scribbled lines so quickly, their pens squealed across notepads. One young reporter mouthed the word "boy" to himself, as if tasting the bitterness of it for the first time. The courthouse clock ticked each second louder than the last. 10 seconds stretched into what felt like 10 minutes. In those endless beats, Marcus's silence transformed into something larger than a gesture. It was not just a refusal to rise, it was a refusal to be diminished. His Navy suit became a second skin, a quiet proclamation of self-worth. It was not flashy, not ostentatious, but dignified, cut with care, chosen deliberately for this morning. Wolfe had tried to strip him of identity with one word, but the fabric itself rejected the insult, absorbing it, suffocating it. Against the officer's fury and the judge's passivity, Marcus's presence was a kind of order that neither badge nor robe could imitate. He embodied control without speaking command, without shouting, and that contrast unsettled the room. Deputy Wolfe's voice cracked again, harsher, trembling at its edges. He demanded recognition, demanded movement, demanded anything that would restore the hierarchy he depended on. But Marcus simply blinked once, slowly, his gaze steady, as if studying a specimen rather than responding to a threat. The officer's rage grew more visible, less disciplined. He shifted his stance boots, scraping against the floor with unnecessary force, trying to summon attention through noise. Yet the more he flailed, the smaller he seemed dwarfed by the very silence that Marcus commanded. Judge Hale finally cleared his throat, though not to address the insult or the officer's loss of composure. He reached for his gavel but stopped midway, hand hovering before retreating. His role in theory was to preserve the dignity of the court, yet here he was preserving only his own distance. His inaction spoke louder than Wolfe's outburst. To remain silent at that moment was not neutrality, it was alignment. Every second of his passivity confirmed to the gallery that power in this courtroom was not blind, not balanced, but biased, leaning heavy toward the familiar figure in uniform. And yet, despite the imbalance, the man seated in navy remained untouched. Marcus's calm was not ignorance of danger, it was mastery of it. He knew every eye was on him, knew every second of stillness carved itself deeper into memory. He knew that his silence exposed more than any outburst could. In refusing to rise, he forced the room to witness itself. To see Wolfe's desperation, Hale's complicity, the gallery's unease. His stillness was a mirror turned outward, and in it, truth shimmered uncomfortably. Somewhere in the back, a boy barely 10 years old tugged on his mother's sleeve, whispering, "Why doesn't he stand?" The mother pressed a finger to her lips, unable to answer. She, like everyone else, sensed that the answer was bigger than the question, too heavy to explain in whispers. It was about more than one man and one insult. It was about years, decades, centuries of demands for obedience, and the rare moments when refusal cracked the facade. As seconds stretched, Marcus's silence gained momentum. It became a gravitational force pulling everything toward it. Wolfe's trembling fury, Hale's tightening jaw, the gallery's restless whispers. What had begun as an insult had become a standoff, though only one man was fighting. The officer with noise, the judge with silence, the accused with stillness. And the stillness, remarkably, was winning. For Wolfe, the silence was humiliation. For Hale, it was disruption. For the gallery, it was revelation. But for Marcus, it was strategy. Each breath he took without moving was a step deeper into control. Each blink was a reminder that rage and power often collapse against restraint. In the span of less than 2 minutes, he had transformed from the target of insult into the center of gravity in the room. No one knew it yet, but this was only the beginning. The trial ahead would unravel lies, expose corruption, and drag hidden truths into daylight. But even before evidence was presented, before documents were unsealed, before federal agents would step through the doors, Marcus Ellison had already shifted the balance. He had proven that dignity can stand taller than fury, that silence can echo louder than insults, and that composure can unmask the weakness behind authority. His stillness was not the pause before a defense, it was the opening argument itself. And as Judge Morton Hale looked down at the man who would not rise, he felt for the first time in years the weight of silence pressing back against his robe. Wolfe had barked the insult had landed, but Marcus Ellison remained seated. And that refusal, simple and unyielding, had already begun to unravel the courtroom from within. The silence was broken, not by Marcus, who sat as steady as carved stone, but by the sharp creak of wood as Deputy Harris Wolfe adjusted himself in the witness stand. His jaw was tight, his face flushed, and his voice, when it rose, carried the crackling strain of a man desperate to regain control. He resisted arrest. Wolfe declared the words thrown into the courtroom like a net meant to trap truth itself. He leaned forward, pointing toward Marcus, with a trembling hand that disguised itself as righteous certainty. I stopped him for reckless driving. He was swerving across lanes like a drunk, endangering everyone on the road. When I approached, he tried to flee. In the struggle, I sustained injuries. His words were coated with the authority of his badge, but beneath them pulsed a frantic energy, the kind of urgency that comes when a lie must be told quickly before silence devours it. The courtroom shifted uneasily. Eyes darted between Wolfe and Marcus, who still did not move, his calm a direct assault on Wolfe's frantic narrative. There were no photographs offered, no medical records of injuries, no dash cam footage to replay, no partner officer to confirm a word of it. Only Wolfe's sweat, glistening faintly on his brow, his story as clean and brittle as glass. The gallery leaned forward, some whispering under breaths, sensing the absence of proof, but wary of voicing it. After all, in courtrooms like this, the uniform was often evidence enough. Judge Morton Hale glanced at Wolfe with an expression that was neither skeptical nor supportive, simply neutral in the way neutrality often served as complicity. His silence lingered like a shadow behind Wolfe's testimony, permitting each word to settle into the record unchallenged. The gavel remained still. Not a single question about evidence, not a single frown at the absence of corroboration. Hale's passivity gave Wolfe's words the oxygen they needed, allowing them to stretch across the chamber like smoke, thin but suffocating. It was then that Prosecutor Elaine Rusk rose her heels, clicking sharply against the polished floor as she stepped into the light of the moment. Rusk was a woman whose reputation in the county was carved on efficiency and loyalty. Loyalty not to justice, but to the system that fed her. She carried herself with a confidence sharpened over 20 years in the courtroom, a confidence built on the belief that a uniform in the witness stand was a shield stronger than truth. Adjusting the papers in her hand, she nodded toward Wolfe. "Deputy Wolfe," she said, with a tone of reassurance, as though steadying him to be absolutely clear. "You are certain that this is the man who resisted your lawful commands?" "Absolutely," Wolfe snapped, slamming his hand against the stand for emphasis. The sound cracked through the silence, startling a few in the gallery. "I never forget the face of a thug." The word burned in the room, and this time gasps rippled through the audience. The insult was not cloaked, not hidden in implication. It was naked, dripping with contempt, and still Judge Hale's gavel remained untouched. He looked down briefly, adjusting the papers before him, as if rearranging documents could distract from the poison staining the air. Marcus finally lifted his head, his eyes locking on Wolfe, but still he did not speak. His silence became the question the courtroom did not want to ask. Where is the evidence Wolfe's testimony unraveled, in its own absence of detail? Yet Elaine Rusk pressed forward her words, acting as scaffolding around his collapsing story. "Ladies and gentlemen of the court," she said, turning her voice outward, "now we must remember that sworn testimony carries weight. We must trust the word of those sworn to protect us. Deputy Wolfe has put his life on the line for this community for over 15 years. His account deserves respect and acceptance as fact." The gallery murmured again, some nodding in quiet agreement, others frowning, their faces creased with skepticism. For many, it was not the first time they had heard testimony without proof, not the first time trust was demanded where evidence was absent. But to challenge it was dangerous to doubt. Allowed was to invite scrutiny or dismissal. The air thickened with resignation, the collective memory of years when the badge's word was iron unbreakable, even when hollow. Elaine Rusk pressed the advantage. The defendant, she said, gesturing toward Marcus, with a precise flick of her hand, was found behind the wheel, erratic, uncooperative, dangerous. The officer is lucky to be here after sustaining harm in the process of his duty. This case is not about technicalities. It is about the safety of our roads, the safety of our community, the respect due to law enforcement. Her words rang rehearsed, polished, through endless repetition, the same lines delivered in countless trials, where the only evidence presented was a uniform's word and a defendant's silence. But Marcus's silence was different. It was not the silence of fear or defeat. It was a silence sharpened into a weapon, drawing attention not to itself, but to the fragility of the words trying to cover it. Every sentence Wolfe and Rusk spoke sounded louder against the backdrop of Marcus's composure, louder but thinner brittle, their desperation exposed by contrast. Wolfe shifted again, repeating his story with slightly altered details, a stumble in sequence, a pause too long before recalling the alleged injuries. He rolled his shoulder, as though it ached, but offered no medical report, no photo of bruising, nothing but the gesture itself. It was chaos, he said, his eyes darting briefly to the prosecutor for confirmation. He swung at me. I had to restrain him. But there were no scratches on Marcus, no torn fabric on his navy suit, no police photos of the alleged resistance. Just Wolfe's word. Judge Hale leaned forward, finally speaking, though his tone was flat, mechanical. "The testimony will stand." With those words, he might as well have carved the lie into stone. Not a single question, not a single demand for evidence. He gave Wolfe the gift of belief without burden, and in doing so revealed again that the courtroom's silence was not passive, it was protection. The gallery stirred outrage humming beneath restraint. Some shook their heads, others sat stiff with quiet anger, but all knew the rhythm. They had seen this song before. The officer speaks, the prosecutor amplifies, the judge permits, and the defendant is left drowning under words that carry more weight than truth. But this time was different. They did not yet know why, but the atmosphere told them something was shifting. Wolfe's voice cracked too often, his hand slammed the stand too hard, Rusk's insistence too rehearsed, Hale's silence too brittle. It was as if the system itself sensed the fault lines beneath its feet. And through it all, Marcus Ellison remained seated, calm, unflinching. He had not yet spoken, had not yet moved, but already he had exposed what they all refused to see, that Wolfe's testimony was smoke without fire, words without proof. His silence turned their noise into confession. The courtroom, once a place where silence meant defeat, was about to learn that silence could also mean strategy. And when Marcus finally chose to break it, the weight of truth would shatter the room. The words of Deputy Harris Wolfe still echoed in the courtroom, brittle and sharp, reinforced by Prosecutor Elaine Rusk's polished assurances, but already cracking under the weight of their own emptiness. Judge Morton Hale, after letting the testimony hang in the air like stale smoke, turned his gaze toward the defendant's table. His voice, low and perfunctory, carried no trace of the authority the robe was meant to lend. "Mr. Ellison," he said, "you may respond briefly." The word briefly was deliberate, an attempt to confine, to cage, to limit the man who had sat through insult and accusation without flinching. Yet it was permission, and permission was all Marcus needed. He leaned forward, placing his hands on the polished table, and for the first time that morning he allowed his voice to enter the chamber. Calm, deliberate, steady, his tone rolled across the courtroom with a gravity that made every head turn. "Am I to respond?" Marcus asked softly. "To the fabricated charges, or to the racial slurs?" The gallery murmured, a ripple of shock passing through the crowd. It was not simply what Marcus said, but how he said it. His voice did not tremble. It did not rise. It carried the authority of someone who knew silence could be broken only when truth was ready to stand. Judge Hale stiffened in his chair gavel, twitching in his hand as if tempted to strike, but he did not. The silence after Marcus's question was more condemning than any verdict Hale could issue. Wolfe's face flushed deeper, and Rusk shifted uncomfortably, her composure cracking at the edges. Marcus tilted his head, studying Wolfe as one might study a restless animal. "You claim I was driving recklessly." He began, each word precise, each phrase landing with the weight of evidence. "That I was swerving, intoxicated, endangering lives. Yet no sobriety test was performed. No breathalyzer, no blood draw, no field test. You leveled the charge, deputy, but you brought no proof." Why his question did not need an answer. It floated above Wolfe, settling into the minds of every person listening. Wolfe shifted in the stand, opening his mouth to respond, but Marcus continued before sound could escape. "No dash cam footage was provided. You patrol in a vehicle equipped with a camera, yet no video exists. Why?" Another pause. "No backup officer was present, no witness, no corroboration. You allege resistance, you allege injury, yet you stand alone on that claim." The courtroom froze beneath the rhythm of Marcus's words. Each question was a scalpel cutting away at the facade of Wolfe's testimony. The officer who had entered the room with his chest puffed now seemed to shrink into the witness stand, his confidence bleeding away under the spotlight of precision. Rusk leaned forward, attempting to interject, but Marcus's voice was a current too strong to interrupt. Strange is it not, Marcus continued his tone, still calm, that an officer who claims such a violent encounter found time to write a pristine incident report, perfect handwriting, neat margins, no mention of delay, no note of chaos, yet somehow forgot to mention his own ongoing internal investigation. The words cut sharper than any blade. Wolfe's head snapped up, eyes wide, his fury spilling into disbelief. The gallery gasped, voices rising like a sudden storm, and Judge Hale slammed his gavel at last. Order, he barked, though the tremor in his voice betrayed the fragility of his command. Marcus did not flinch at the sound. He reached into his briefcase and drew out a manila envelope, its seal unbroken, until this moment. He laid it carefully on the table, then pushed it forward so the court could see. This, he said, voice steady, is a sealed audit. It shows that Deputy Wolfe's unit records 37% more cases of alleged resistance when the drivers are black than when they are white. 37%. That number is not coincidence. That number is a pattern. The room erupted again, the gallery gasping, whispering, mothers clutching hands, fathers shaking their heads in bitter recognition. The number was a blade slicing through the lie that Wolfe's testimony stood on. Elaine Rusk shot to her feet, her voice shrill with objection. Irrelevant. This is inflammatory, Your Honor. But her words were drowned beneath the weight of truth that Marcus had just released into the air. Hale raised his gavel again, but the sound no longer commanded. It rattled hollow, an echo of authority already slipping away. Wolfe stammered, trying to defend himself. That audit is biased. It's incomplete. It doesn't. But Marcus leaned forward, eyes locked on him, the calm in his gaze, cutting sharper than anger ever could. Biased, Marcus repeated, voice dropping, low-measured, or inconvenient. He turned toward the gallery, his words no longer directed only at Wolfe, but at every ear in the room. When numbers tell the same story, families have told for years, it is not bias, it is confirmation. The air grew heavier with each syllable. The courtroom that had once seemed to belong to Wolfe and Hale now bent toward Marcus, the man who sat in silence until truth was ready to emerge. His composure was not just unsettling, it was commanding. Every detail he spoke unraveled Wolfe's carefully constructed lie. The absence of tests, the absence of footage, the absence of backup all revealed not oversight, but intention. The pristine report, the 37% disparity, those were not cracks in the story. They were fractures in a wall long held up by silence. And Marcus was not done. His voice, still calm, carried a resonance that made the gallery lean in reporters' pens, racing to capture every word. You, Deputy Wolfe, built your authority on the assumption that silence protects you, that your word unsupported would be taken as fact, that a robe on the bench and a seal on the wall would cover the gaps. But silence does not erase truth. It only delays it. And delay does not make it less powerful. It makes it sharper when it arrives. Wolfe opened his mouth again, but the words caught in his throat. His hands fumbled at the edge of the stand, fingers drumming nervously against wood. The confidence with which he had declared Marcus a thug minutes earlier had evaporated, replaced with the unease of a man unprepared for scrutiny. Rusk glanced at Hale, searching for support, but the judge's pale face betrayed nothing except unease. The robe weighed heavy now, a garment that no longer shielded him from complicity. Marcus let the silence stretch his gaze, sweeping across the room, settling on Wolfe once more. "So tell us, Deputy," he said softly, the calm of his voice now laced with steel. "What is it exactly that you are asking this court to believe? That a man drove recklessly, resisted, violently injured you, and yet left no mark, no evidence, no witness, no record? Or is it that your word alone is enough because you wear a badge, and I wear this suit?" The question hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. The gallery shifted, murmuring some clapping hands to mouths, as though afraid of what might follow. The silence that returned now was not the silence of complicity. It was the silence of revelation. For the first time, the weight of Wolfe's words seemed fragile, breakable measured against the precision of Marcus's calm dismantling. And in that moment, it was clear to all the tide in the courtroom had turned. The officer's fury, the prosecutor's loyalty, the judge's passivity, all of it trembled beneath the steady hand of a man who had spoken only when ready, who had sat silent until silence itself became unbearable. Marcus Ellison had spoken, and the courtroom would never return to the silence it once mistook for order. The silence that followed Marcus's dismantling of Wolfe's testimony was unlike any silence that had come before. It was not heavy with complicity, not thick with resignation. It was alive, trembling with realization. The gallery sat frozen, their eyes darting between the officer unraveling in the witness stand and the man in the navy suit, whose calm voice had just stripped the testimony bare. Judge Morton Hale shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his hand hovering near the gavel, but never striking it, as though he knew the sound would not restore the authority already slipping away. Prosecutor Elaine Rusk whispered urgently to Wolfe, but her words vanished in the vacuum Marcus had created. For a long, taut moment, no one spoke. Then Marcus, steady as ever, reached down to the polished oak table before him and drew out a second envelope slightly thicker than the first, its seal unbroken, its weight undeniable. He set it on the table with quiet deliberation, the sound of paper on wood louder than Wolfe's earlier outburst. "You all assume I sit here as a defendant?" Marcus said, his voice calm, but carrying across the room with the weight of a hammer. "You assume I came to answer charges. But no one has asked who I am. No one has asked why I wear this suit today." The gallery stirred whispers darting like sparks across dry grass. Reporters leaned forward, pens poised. Hale narrowed his eyes, his jaw tightening, though the crease in his forehead betrayed unease. "What are you suggesting?" "Mr. Ellison," he asked, his voice brittle. Marcus's steady gaze turned to the bench, unflinching. "Not suggesting, Your Honor. Declaring." His hands broke the seal of the envelope with a slow, deliberate tear. He unfolded the papers, their edges crisp, their letterhead glinting beneath the fluorescent lights. The seal of the Department of Justice shone from the top. He held the pages aloft, his voice cutting through the chamber. "This is my certified appointment as Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court, effective as of last week." The words detonated in the courtroom. Gasps erupted from the gallery loud enough to rattle the windows. Reporters shot to their feet, pens forgotten, some nearly dropping their notepads. Elaine Rusk's face drained of color, her composure shattering into open shock. Wolfe, red with fury only moments before, now sat stunned, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water. Judge Hale blinked, his pale face slackening into disbelief, his hand falling from the gavel as if it weighed too much to hold. The silence that followed was not empty. It was awe, the kind of silence that comes when the ground shifts beneath everyone's feet at once. Marcus rose to his feet, slowly, deliberately. The navy suit, once dismissed as arrogance or vanity, now gleamed with new meaning. It was no longer just a defendant's attire. It was the uniform of authority chosen not for show, but for revelation. Against Wolfe's tarnished badge and Hale's compromised robe, Marcus's suit became a symbol of power, hidden in plain sight, of dignity carried even under insult. He stood taller now, not because his body had changed, but because the truth had revealed itself around him. The gallery, still stunned, could not take their eyes off him. "I was tasked," Marcus continued, his voice calm but sharpened with steel, with a covert review of courtroom bias in this county. No titles, no cameras, just silence, just observation. You did not know me because you were never meant to. I came to see how truth is handled, when stripped of rank, when stripped of recognition. And what I found is exactly what I feared. His gaze cut toward Judge Hale. I was insulted, called boy, and you, Your Honor, said nothing. You failed your robe, and you failed your oath. The gallery gasped again, louder this time, some leaning forward as if to catch every syllable. Hale's face flushed pale, his lips fumbling for words. This violates procedure, he stammered. No, Marcus cut in, his voice cold and precise. What violates justice is your silence. What violates justice is your protection of false testimony, your willingness to let lies stand unchallenged. What violates justice is the rot that has settled in this very room. His words rang like verdicts, undeniable, irreversible. Wolfe slammed his fist against the stand. This is a trick, he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. He's no justice. He's lying. But Marcus turned toward him with a calm that sliced sharper than rage. You assumed, deputy. You saw a black man in a suit and thought, target. You forgot to do your homework. I clerked for federal judges. I drafted policy on racial profiling. And now I hold your record in my hands. He reached into his briefcase again, pulling another thick file and tossing it across the prosecutor's table. Papers spilled across the wood: complaints, misconduct reports, body cam failures. I did my homework. Did you? The gallery roared now, voices rising in disbelief, anger, vindication. Some clapped hands to their mouths, others whispered prayers under their breath. The air vibrated with the weight of revelation. Elaine Rusk scrambled to collect the papers, her hands trembling, as she flipped through damning reports she had never seen. Judge Hale raised his gavel again, his voice shaking. Enough, this court will not. But Marcus's voice overpowered him. This court will. This court must. Because today, truth sits in this chair, not silence. Authority rests in this suit, not your robe. And justice has a new name. His words thundered through the chamber, reverberating against the walls, against the people, against the very system that had tried to bury him beneath insult. The reporters in the gallery scrambled to capture every moment, their cameras flashing, their pens racing. Headlines were already forming in their minds. Defendant revealed as Chief Justice. Courtroom upended in shocking reversal. Wolfe's face drained of fury into disbelief, his lips trembling as he realized the man he had called boy now held the highest gavel in the state. Hale's robe suddenly looked less like a garment of power and more like a costume of failure. And Marcus, standing tall in his navy suit, transformed before their eyes from accused to arbiter, from defendant to judge. He turned back toward the gallery, his gaze softening for a moment as he looked into the faces of families who had carried the weight of silence for too long. Mothers who had lost sons, fathers who had buried nephews, brothers and sisters who had lived under suspicion. This is not my victory, he said, his voice steady but filled with fire. This is justice, reforged when broken. This is truth, uncovered, undeniable. Today is not about me. It is about every one of you who sat in silence because you thought silence was safer. Today, silence has ended. The room erupted again, some in tears, some in applause, others still stunned into disbelief. and in the center of it all stood Marcus Ellison. No longer the silent defendant, no longer the target of insult, but the Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court, revealed not through titles or ceremony, but through truth itself. The Navy suit, once a mark of quiet dignity, now gleamed as the uniform of hidden authority, a symbol that the days of silence in that courtroom had come to an end. The shock of Marcus Ellison's revelation still rattled the courtroom, but he did not let the silence breathe long enough to settle. While Judge Morton Hale sat paralyzed in disbelief, while Elaine Rusk clutched at scattered documents with trembling fingers, while Deputy Harris Wolfe's fury curdled into confusion, Marcus reached once more into the leather briefcase at his side. From it, he withdrew not just a single envelope, but a thick binder, its spine creased from weight, its tabs marked in meticulous order. He placed it on the prosecutor's table with a thud that made pens jump and hearts race. This, he said, voice calm but unyielding, is the federal audit of Deputy Wolfe's unit over the last 7 years. Inside are the numbers that you cannot bury the records. You cannot erase the stories you cannot silence. He opened the binder, flipping pages so the gallery could see columns of figures, highlighted rows, the cold arithmetic of injustice. Dozens of complaints filed. Dozens. Allegations of excessive force. Reports of falsified records. Broken body cameras that just happened to malfunction at the exact moment force was used. And resistance cases 37% higher when the driver is black. The words were daggers, but the numbers were hammers. Each statistic struck harder than the last, shattering the fragile structure Wolfe had tried to erect with his testimony. Marcus turned a page, his finger tracing down the column. 27 complaints from black citizens dismissed. 12 reports of malfunctioning dash cams archived. 84 traffic stops where resistance was claimed without video evidence cleared. These are not coincidences. These are patterns. His gaze swept across the room, lingering on Wolfe, whose hands now clenched the witness stand as if holding on to splinters of power. And patterns tell the truth, even when men lie. The gallery gasped, the sound of realization breaking like a storm. Mothers clutched hands to mouths. Fathers leaned forward with narrowed eyes. Reporters scribbled furiously, their notes struggling to keep pace with revelation. Marcus let the sound rise, then stilled it with his voice. "But this is not just about numbers," he said, his tone deepening, darkening. "This is about lives." He flipped again, landing on a page marked in bold. His voice slowed, each word deliberate, each syllable heavy. Case file June 14, 2022. Traffic stop. Officer of record, Deputy Harris Wolfe. Driver, Franklin Liam Monroe. Charge broken tail light. Outcome deceased. The room inhaled sharply, as if struck by a single blow. Somewhere in the gallery, an elderly woman gasped, clutching her chest with trembling hands. Tears welled in her eyes as whispers of the name spread across the benches. Franklin Monroe. A man, a neighbor, a father reduced in Wolfe's report to a statistic now resurrected in Marcus's voice. Marcus closed the binder, halfway, his hand resting on it like a gavel. The official record says Franklin Monroe died of exhaustion during the stop, but the GPS data shows Wolfe's car parked off-route for 45 minutes. No footage, no backup, no explanation. Just silence. The gallery erupted, voices overlapping, grief breaking into outrage. Some wept openly, others shouted their voices, carrying names of brothers, sons, fathers they had lost. The bailiff called for order, his voice cracking under the weight of the moment, but the tide was too strong. Marcus raised his hand, palm open, and the noise dimmed, not silenced, but softened into a hum of grief and anger. He spoke again, steady, unwavering. Franklin Monroe was not the only one. His name is here today because it is written in this audit. But how many others were written out? How many others disappeared into silence? Their stories buried beneath reports, as clean and false as the one Wolfe filed against me. Wolfe shifted violently, his voice breaking into the chamber. This is a smear. You can't prove, but Marcus cut him off, his words sharp as steel. I can prove what silence cannot hide. He reached into the binder and pulled out photographs, still shots of broken body cameras logged for repair incident reports, with redacted sections, sworn complaints marked unsubstantiated. He held them up for all to see. This is not a smear. This is accountability. This is the truth you tried to bury beneath your badge. The gallery gasped again, louder this time, as the photographs passed down the rows of benches. One mother broke into sobs, clutching the image of her son's name on a redacted page. A father shook his head, whispering curses under his breath. Reporters snapped photographs of photographs, capturing the very evidence that would unravel years of silence. The energy in the courtroom shifted entirely. What had begun as a trial had transformed into an unmasking, a reckoning. Judge Hale's hand trembled on the gavel, his lips parting as if to speak, but no sound came. His authority had drained from him, leaving only the pale outline of a man caught in his own complicity. Elaine Rusk sat, frozen papers strewn around her, the narrative she had built, collapsing in real time. And Wolfe, once red with fury, was now pale sweat dripping from his brow, his body slumping in the stand as though the weight of the binder had crushed him. Marcus stepped closer, his eyes never leaving Wolfe. His voice dropped low, deliberate, carrying not just authority, but finality. For years you thought the badge made you untouchable. That silence would protect you, that a robe on the bench would shield you. And for years you were right. But today, the silence breaks. He turned then away from Wolfe toward the gallery. His voice lifted, addressing not the court, but the people. To the families who were silenced, to the mothers who buried sons, to the fathers who carried grief, your stories are written here. You were not wrong. You were not alone. You were ignored. But not anymore. Tears streamed down faces, hands clutched in solidarity, whispers of amen rising from the back rows. The grief of years met the fire of truth, and the collision filled the courtroom with a power no gavel could contain. Marcus closed the binder slowly, the sound of its clap like the closing of a cell door. He placed it gently on the table, his hands steady, his gaze unwavering. This courtroom, he said, voice ringing, was built to protect truth. Instead, it protected lies. But today, the lies are over. And in that moment, it was clear to all the spotlight no longer shone on Marcus Ellison as an accused man. It burned now on Harris Wolfe, on the judge who had been silent, on the prosecutor who had defended the indefensible. The gallery saw it. The press saw it. The world beyond those walls would soon see it too. Truth had collided with grief, and grief had erupted into outrage. And once revealed, it could never again be hidden. The air in the courtroom was still charged from the revelation of Franklin Monroe's death, grief and outrage hanging over the chamber like a storm that refused to pass. Families wept softly, others whispered angrily. The reporters' pens scratched furiously across paper, as if trying to keep pace with history unfolding. Deputy Harris Wolfe slumped in the stand, pale and trembling, his authority shredded by the weight of the binder Marcus had revealed. But Marcus was not finished. He turned once more to his briefcase, and this time when he withdrew the envelope, it was thinner, smaller, yet far more dangerous than the thick binder of statistics. He held it up with 2 fingers, letting the seal catch the light. This, he said, voice firm but calm, is an affidavit. Sworn under oath. Written by a retired lieutenant who was forced out of his post for trying to expose corruption in this precinct. In it are words that tie not only Wolfe, but this very bench to the cover-up of misconduct. The gallery gasped again, sharper this time, the words igniting a flame that spread quickly through the rows. Judge Morton Hale stiffened visibly, his knuckles whitening as they gripped the arms of his chair. "Mr. Ellison," he began, but Marcus silenced him with a raised hand, a gesture so simple yet commanding that even the robe seemed to shrink beneath it. "You will have your turn," Marcus said coldly. Then he broke the seal, unfolded the affidavit, and read aloud. "I was told by Judge Morton Hale to clear Deputy Harris Wolfe's misconduct report. I was instructed not to file disciplinary actions, not to escalate complaints, and to remember the words." Marcus's voice slowed, each word sharpened like a blade. "We protect our own." The room erupted. Gasps became shouts, the gallery leaning forward as though pulled by an invisible cord. One man shouted, "I knew it," while others broke into cries of grief and fury. The bailiff called for order, his voice cracking, but order had already been shattered. Hale's face drained of color, his lips trembling as he tried to speak. "That affidavit is inadmissible," he stammered. But Marcus cut him off again, his voice slicing clean through the chaos. "Inadmissible or undeniable? You didn't just fail to act, Judge Hale, you acted to protect. You silenced the truth, not once, but again and again. And your silence today, when I was called boy, was not the silence of shock. It was habit. It was cover-up, dressed in the robe of neutrality." The gavel in Hale's hand struck the bench once-twice, but the sound was hollow-drowned beneath the rising storm of outrage. The robe that had once cloaked him in authority now looked like a shroud of complicity. He opened his mouth to deny it, but the words faltered thin and weak against the affidavit in Marcus's hand. The truth had already taken root in the room, and no denial could pull it out. Marcus turned from Hale to Elaine Rusk, who sat frozen at the prosecutor's table, her once steady composure fractured into silence. Papers lay scattered around her, her hand clutching a pen that no longer moved. "And you, Prosecutor Rusk Marcus," said his voice narrowing to a blade. "How many of these reports crossed your desk? How many complaints dismissed without review? How many cases built on the word of an officer you never questioned, though the numbers screamed for scrutiny?" Rusk opened her mouth, but nothing came. Her lips parted, then closed again, as though words might choke her if spoken aloud. Marcus's gaze sharpened. "You ask this court to take his testimony at face value, yet you never once looked at the faces of the men and women who filed complaints against him. You told the families to trust the badge, but you betrayed their trust. And now your office will answer for that negligence." Reporters scribbled faster, some whispering headlines to one another. Families in the gallery wept openly. Others shouted their voices, carrying demands for justice, not just against Wolfe, but against the system that shielded him. Hale tried once more to intervene, his voice trembling. "You have no authority to." But Marcus stepped closer to the bench, his eyes locked on the judge, his voice dropping low resonant. "At midnight, my appointment took effect. And as Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court, my authority does not need your permission. My first act is to open a federal review into this precinct and this courtroom. Every complaint, every dismissal, every silence will be examined. And you, Judge Hale, you will be the first to face that scrutiny." The gallery roared again, the sound like thunder breaking through the walls. Hale's face collapsed, his lips quivering, his hands trembling as he clutched the bench as though it might anchor him. But the robe could not shield him now. His silence had been his weapon, his shield, his mask, but Marcus had torn it away, revealing the rot beneath. Rusk attempted a final defense, her voice trembling. This isn't procedure," she stammered, but Marcus's gaze swept over her like fire. "Procedure? You dare speak of procedure after years of ignoring it, after years of letting this officer's word outweigh the cries of families, after dismissing evidence as irrelevant and calling truth inflammatory? No, prosecutor. The days of your office hiding behind procedure are over. From this day forward, your negligence will no longer be invisible. Every case tied to this officer will be reopened. Every silence will be accounted for." The courtroom was electric now, grief and outrage colliding with vindication. Families who had sat in silence for years felt their voices rise in the body of Marcus Ellison. Reporters captured every moment, their headlines writing themselves in real time. Judge implicated in cover-up. Prosecutor's office under fire. Defendant revealed as Chief Justice. Marcus let the noise swell, then raised his hand once more, and slowly the chamber quieted. His voice, calm but relentless, filled the room. "You thought justice was blind. But blindfolds can be misused not to protect fairness, but to shield corruption. Today that blindfold is ripped away, and those who used silence as cover will finally answer for it." Hale's gavel slipped from his hand, clattering against the bench, the sound pitiful compared to the roar of truth. He lowered his head, shoulders slumping beneath the weight of exposure. Rusk sat paralyzed, her face pale, her future unraveling before her eyes. And Marcus stood tall, the navy suit gleaming the embodiment of authority, reclaimed not by title alone, but by truth made flesh. The gallery erupted into tears, shouts, prayers, the long-buried grief of years colliding with the vindication of the moment. For the first time, they saw the system not as untouchable, but as accountable. And in that charged silence between outrage and relief, one truth became undeniable. Marcus Ellison had not just exposed a corrupt officer. He had torn open the shield of the judge and the prosecutor who protected him. And once exposed, they could never again return to silence. The courtroom shook with the weight of revelation, the gallery alive with gasps, cries, and murmurs of outrage. Judge Morton Hale sat, slumped his gavel, useless, his robe heavy with disgrace. Prosecutor Elaine Rusk stared down at the papers scattered before her hands, trembling, the scaffolding of her authority crumbling. Deputy Harris Wolfe's face was a storm of panic and fury, sweat dripping from his temple as his grip on the stand tightened, like a drowning man clutching driftwood. And then, just as the chaos threatened to swallow the chamber whole, the double doors at the rear creaked open. Silence fell like a stone. Two men entered their steps, measured their presence, unmistakable U.S. Marshals, their badges glinting, their jackets marked with authority that could not be questioned. Their boots struck the floor in rhythm, each sound echoing like a drumbeat of justice drawing near. The gallery hushed, every eye following them as they walked steadily down the aisle. The storm of outrage bent into a silence so taut it could snap. One marshal carried a thick envelope sealed with federal insignia. The other held a small black case. They stopped before the bench, presenting both to Marcus Ellison, who remained standing at the defendant's table, or what once had been the defendant's table. He took the envelope, broke the seal, and withdrew the documents within his calm hands, steady even as the room trembled. He held the papers high. By order of the Department of Justice, Marcus announced, his voice carrying like thunder across the chamber, Deputy Harris Wolfe is hereby arrested for falsification of records, obstruction of justice, perjury, and multiple civil rights violations. The gallery erupted, some in gasps, others in cheers, others in tears. Wolfe shot to his feet, his chair clattering against the floor. "This is a lie," he shouted, his voice shrill, cracking like glass under pressure. "You can't do this. I'm the law." His words hung pathetic against the weight of the marshals who stepped toward him. He backed into the stand, his eyes darting wildly between Hale and Rusk, as though searching for allies. But Hale's face was pale and broken. Rusk's eyes lowered to the floor, and for the first time in his career, Harris Wolfe stood alone. The marshal nearest him produced a pair of cuffs, the metallic click loud as a gunshot in the chamber. "Deputy Harris Wolfe," he intoned, "you are under arrest." The cuffs snapped shut around Wolfe's wrists. His shoulders sagged, as though the sound itself had broken him. The gallery cried out again, some in relief, others in vindication, others still in grief that this day had taken so long to arrive. Wolfe thrashed once, then stilled his head. Lowering his fury, curdled into the look of a man who had finally discovered the limits of his power. He was led away, no longer feared, no longer untouchable, just another man stripped of pretense, his legacy undone by the very justice he had mocked. Judge Hale watched the scene unfold with wide, trembling eyes. His lips parted as though to protest, but the words caught in his throat. He looked down at his robe, at the gavel resting limp in his hand, and seemed to see them for what they were, not symbols of justice, but shields he had used to cover silence, excuses he had worn like armor. The marshal holding the black case stepped forward and handed Marcus a folded sheet of paper. Hale's eyes caught the heading before Marcus even spoke an official recusal order. His face collapsed, his shoulders sinking deeper into the chair. Marcus's voice, calm but unrelenting, filled the room. "Judge Morton Hale, you are named in a sworn affidavit for obstructing discipline, for shielding misconduct, for failing the oath you swore. As Chief Justice, I call upon you to recuse yourself from this case immediately." Hale's hand shook violently. He looked at the gallery, at the families whose eyes burned with grief, at the reporters whose pens raced, at the marshals who stood ready, and at Marcus, whose calm presence now dwarfed him. The silence demanded his answer. His lips quivered, his throat bobbed, and then, with a shuddering breath, he reached up with trembling fingers and tore the robe from his shoulders. The black fabric slipped down like a curtain at the end of a play, collapsing onto the bench in a heap of disgrace. His gavel fell with it, clattering pitifully across the floor. He stumbled to his feet, muttering words no one could understand, and descended from the bench he had occupied for years. The gallery did not cheer. They watched in silence as he shuffled out, robe abandoned, authority shattered. The bench stood empty. For a heartbeat, the courtroom seemed suspended. In time, the symbols of power stripped away. Then Marcus Ellison turned, his navy suit gleaming, and stepped slowly toward the bench. The gallery rose instinctively, not out of obligation, but out of awe, their bodies responding to the weight of truth that now moved before them. Marcus paused at the base of the steps, his gaze sweeping across the room. He looked at the families, at the reporters, at the marshals, at the empty chair where Hale had sat. Then he ascended each step, measured, deliberate, as though marking the path from silence to truth. When he reached the bench, he did not immediately sit. He stood behind it, resting his hand on the wood, his voice rising once more. "Authority is not the robe," he said firmly. "Authority is not the badge. Authority is truth. And today, truth has reclaimed this court." His words reverberated through the chamber, echoing in every corner, searing themselves into memory. Then, with deliberate calm, Marcus lowered himself into the seat Hale had abandoned. The gallery erupted applause, sobs, shouts, prayers rising as one. The bailiff, his own voice trembling, called out the words that sealed the moment. "All rise for the Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court." Every person in the room stood, tears glistening, voices hushed in awe. Marcus sat tall in the chair, his navy suit now brighter than any robe, his calm presence commanding without demand. The transition was complete. Authority had passed symbolically and irrevocably from corrupt silence to righteous truth. The robe lay discarded on the floor, forgotten. The badge that had once cowed families into silence jingled uselessly on Wolfe's chest as he was led away in chains. And on the bench, Marcus Ellison sat not as a defendant, not as a victim, but as justice itself, reforged in plain sight. The reckoning had come, and the courtroom, once heavy with silence, now pulsed with a power that could not be silenced again. The roar of the gallery still trembled in the air, the sound of relief, vindication, and disbelief colliding in waves that shook the chamber to its foundation. Marcus Ellison sat on the bench, his navy suit gleaming brighter than any robe, his posture steady, his expression calm. For a moment, the courtroom seemed to breathe differently, as though the very walls recognized that something long hidden had been unearthed, something buried beneath silence, now set free. He placed both hands on the bench before him, leaning slightly forward, and when his voice rose, it was not thunder. It was the measured, deliberate cadence of a man who understood that justice was not spectacle, but promise. From this day forward, Marcus said, each syllable steady as stone, every conviction tied to Deputy Harris Wolfe will be reopened and re-examined. Every case, every report, every silence buried in those files will be unearthed. No family will be ignored. No voice will be dismissed. The truth will not be delayed any longer. The gallery erupted again, not with wild applause, but with the sound of grief finding air. Mothers clutched hands to their mouths, sobbing openly. Fathers bowed their heads, whispering prayers through clenched jaws. Reporters scribbled frantically, some barely keeping up with the words, knowing they were watching history write itself in real time. The bailiff, who only minutes ago had tried to silence the crowd with procedural commands, now stood silently at attention, his eyes shining with something close to reverence. The very air felt changed, electrified, as though truth itself had taken a seat at the bench. Marcus's gaze moved from the files before him to the people in the gallery. His voice softened, but carried no less weight. To the families who sat here year after year watching silence defend lies, I see you. To the mothers who buried sons and were told it was their fault, I hear you. To the fathers who carried shame that was never theirs to carry, you were right. You always knew the truth. The court failed you. I failed you. That ends today. Tears streamed freely now, not only from the families but from strangers who had come to witness, from clerks who had seen too much in silence, from officers in the gallery who shifted uncomfortably as the mirror of truth was held up to their profession. The chamber was heavy with memory, with years of grief pressed into a single moment of acknowledgement. Marcus let it sit, let it breathe, because justice was not only about verdicts, it was about recognition. He continued, his voice gaining strength once more. Justice is not blind. That lie has been told for too long. Justice is not blind, it remembers. It remembers the names written in complaints dismissed without cause. It remembers the voices cut off by silence. It remembers the truth buried beneath reports, written in clean margins, but soaked in deceit. and it will remember you." Gasps and murmurs swept the gallery at his words. For decades, families had been told justice was blind, impartial, neutral. Marcus shattered that myth with a single declaration: justice did not close its eyes, it carried memory, and memory was power. He looked directly into the crowd, now his eyes searching, until they landed on a young girl in the front row, no older than 10, her hair tied back with a simple ribbon. Her small hands clutched tightly around her mother's arm. Her wide eyes stared at Marcus not with fear, but with a kind of reverent awe, as though she knew she was seeing something she would never forget. Marcus stepped down from the bench, his shoes echoing against the floor, the gallery parting slightly as he walked toward the girl. The reporters leaned forward, cameras flashing, pens still scratching furiously, but Marcus's focus was fixed. He stopped before the girl, lowering himself to one knee so that his eyes met hers directly. The room hushed, every whisper, every breath pausing to listen. His voice softened into something almost intimate, meant not just for her, but for everyone who would carry the memory of this moment. "What's your name?" he asked gently. The girl swallowed hard before answering. "Leah." Marcus nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "Leah," he said, his words firm but warm. "Remember, this justice isn't blind, it remembers. And as long as you carry truth, no robe, no badge, no silence will ever take it from you." Tears spilled down the child's cheeks as her mother pulled her close, whispering prayers of gratitude into her hair. Around them, the gallery erupted into quiet sobs, into gasps, into murmured affirmations. Marcus's words were no longer just a lesson to a child, they were a promise to a generation. He rose slowly, turning now to face the entire chamber. His voice carried again, stronger, resolute. "Do not leave this room believing today is about me. It is not. Today is about justice, about truth, about breaking the silence that has cost too many lives. The robe does not define justice. The badge does not define justice. Truth does. And truth will endure long after robes and badges are gone." The marshals stood at the doors, Wolfe already escorted out in chains, Hale gone in disgrace, Rusk silent at her table. The symbols of false power had crumbled, replaced by the steady figure of a man who had begun this day as a defendant, and ended it as the steward of justice itself. Reporters pressed forward now, the clicking of cameras and the hum of microphones filling the air. The bailiff tried once more to call order, but Marcus raised his hand, stilling the room. He stepped down from the bench, moving not toward the exit reserved for judges, but toward the gallery, toward the people. The reporters swarmed, their voices rising in overlapping questions, but Marcus raised his hand again, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Today is not about me," he declared, his words ringing clear, echoing against the walls. "It is about justice." The cameras flashed, capturing the moment, his figure framed in light, his navy suit sharp, his face steady. The gallery erupted into applause and tears, some calling his name, others whispering prayers of gratitude. But Marcus did not linger in the spotlight. He walked into it only long enough to redirect it, to remind everyone watching that power did not rest in a single man, but in truth itself. And as he disappeared into the press swarm, the courthouse seemed to exhale. The robe lay discarded on the floor, the gavel silenced, the badge stripped of its false protection. A new nameplate would soon gleam outside these doors: the Honorable Marcus Ellison, Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court. But the true legacy of this day was not a title, not a plaque, not even a bench reclaimed. It was the memory of silence broken, the echo of truth spoken, and the promise given to a young girl named Leah Justice isn't blind, it remembers. And for the first time in years, the people believed it. What does this story teach us as citizens of the United States? It shows us that silence is never neutral. It is a decision. Judge Hale's silence when Marcus was insulted. His silence when Wolfe lied. His silence when families cried out. Those silences were not accidents, they were choices. And they remind us that when we, the people, stay quiet in the face of injustice, we strengthen the very systems that oppress. Marcus's stand, his calm, his refusal to bow, proved that dignity can disrupt that truth, can outlast lies, and that authority is nothing without accountability. His words to lay a justice isn't blind. It remembers we're not only for her, but for all of us. Justice remembers every silence we tolerated, every neighbor we failed to defend, every report we ignored, every voice we dismissed. But it also remembers every time we chose to speak, every protest we joined, every vote we cast, every truth we insisted on repeating. This story is a mirror asking, will we be like Judge Hale, hiding behind silence? Or will we be like Marcus, steady, unshaken, and unafraid to uncover the truth? The lesson is clear: power does not rest in robes or badges. It rests in people willing to hold those symbols accountable. And accountability begins with us. If you believe justice must not only be spoken, but lived, if you believe silence should no longer protect corruption, then carry this story beyond the courtroom. Share it at your dinner tables, in your classrooms, in your communities. Let it remind you that truth delayed is not truth denied, and that democracy only breathes when citizens demand it to. This video is more than a story, it is a call, and we need every voice. So I urge you right now, don't just watch in silence. Subscribe to the channel to stay connected to stories that reveal the hidden truths of our nation. Like this video to show your stand for justice. Share it with your friends, family, and community, so that more Americans remember what Marcus told Leah: justice isn't blind, it remembers. And together, if we refuse silence, justice will not just remember, it will prevail.